Hello and welcome. My name is John Hoyt. I'm the Solutions Consultant here at TMC, Technology Management Concepts. And today's webinar, I'm going to be going over what I describe as how to get the most out of your Dynamics GP system. We're going to focus primarily on GP 2018, but a lot of what we talk about, a lot of what I show you will be applicable to some of the more recent versions as well. Some things would be exclusive. What I really want to try to do, though, is help people understand the depth and the breadth of the solution that you own, and maybe talk about some areas that you haven't seen before or that you've seen before but have not yet had a chance to implement. Maybe now's the time to start to think about taking advantage of some of those tools that Microsoft's been adding over the past couple of versions of the product, which in all honesty have not focused so much on the individual features and functions inside the GP system proper, but more about how GP can become more accessible and more useful to the larger organization. So that's today's focus, how to get most out of GP 2018. In a couple of weeks, if you're curious to see where the other side of the product family is moving forward, I'm going to do something very similar for the Dynamics 365 BC product. This is what has become from the original NAV product, so kind of the sister, and some different approaches are being taken there. You're welcome to join us for that one as well. Before we dive really too deep into what I think are some of the important features and functions and so forth out of GP 2018, I want to start with a roadmap. We are continuing to develop the product. Microsoft is continuing to make investments, adding new features, new function, new integrations to other parts of the larger Microsoft system. A lot of that is actually being driven as feature requests coming in from the user base, people like yourself. You can create your own kind of wish list items that you'd like Microsoft to focus on. Hey, it'd be really great if you guys could just add in this. And there you go through those lists. Those issues or those topics that get the highest yes votes are where they focus their development effort on next. So you can definitely have an impact on the kind of future where this product is going to be going if you choose to. As a reminder of what everybody owns in Dynamics GP, these are the starter pack features as of GP 2018. Not a lot of new things, as I said, going back over the couple of previous versions. And if you don't have that document, I would again suggest you reach out to Jim Kaltzis, our account manager. I'll have his email up in just a little bit for the What's New in GP 2018 X document that I put together earlier this year, which is a summary of all the new features and new functions that have been added, going back really to GP 2013, all the way forward to GP 2018, what's current. So you may see some things on here that you aren't currently using. You do have access to them, however. And so if it's an area of your business that you'd like to enhance or get greater control over, you don't have a lot of knowledge about those, reach out to Jim or reach out to myself. We're happy to go through those kind of details, let you know what you can and cannot do within your system. And then for some people, you also have the extended pack. This really focuses on some specific functionality around manufacturing, around project management, project accounting, or deeper into the supply chain, whether it's the available to promise or some of the warehouse distribution suite, etc. And then over on the right-hand side on the a la carte, these are available with either the starter pack or with the starter and extended. They're just standalone purchases. The customization pack, if you're doing anything that requires integration, you need to tie in new software, new features, new functions, want to work with web services, etc. Our consulting team uses this tool a lot when we are connecting to external systems of one kind or another. And then for those of you that are using the HR payroll functionality out of the starter pack, there's some extended features available a la carte again if you do things like I do my resourcing and my time management based upon a position code, not based upon an individual employee. So I do shift work or differential work or something of that type. For the demo today, I really want to kind of focus in three different areas. I want to talk about some specific features and functions that are relatively new to the system. many of you may not be using, and I think they add a great deal of value. I want to talk then about some of the reports and analytic tools that are now part of the package, all standard functionality there. And then finally, some things around tools and automation. How can we take what might be a manual process or an ad hoc process and turn that into something that's going to be an automated process for you, and make sure we have proper controls around that. So within features and functions, I want to focus on 4 areas: revenue and expense deferrals, subledger reconciliations to GL, just a means of speeding up month-end or year-end close processing, purchase requisitions and purchase order prepayments, greater control over the supply chain and the purchasing cycle by putting those controls and approvals in up front. And then finally, something Microsoft released a couple versions back that really didn't get much notice at all, but can really meet some people's needs really well. You can now custom define payment terms, whether for payables or for receivables, but far greater control and a little more granular detail than we could have done in the past. Again, if you don't have the What's New in GP 2018 PDF, there's Jim's email at the bottom there. Go ahead and shoot him a quick email and say, can you send me that PDF document? And again, it's a cumulative document, goes back all the way to GP 2013 and talks about all the different features and functions that have been added over the past 4 release cycles. Okay, so I want to start inside the GP homepage, of course, and drill down into the financial setups. And we're going to talk about the deferrals, how we set up revenue and expense deferrals. There are 2 areas inside here we'll talk about. There's a standard kind of deferral setup, and this simply is any other setup screen that I'd use inside the GP system, right? Real basic, what's my next audit number? What's the next GL document that I want to create for this? Which parts of the system do I want to do the deferrals within? And what methods do I want to use for setting those up? And then an example of the deferral profiles themselves, you can see in the first box, the module box, you can have these revenue or expense deferrals predefined anywhere you want inside those modules. And what we're really doing here is we're creating within one single process. I'm going to handle a transaction one time, and I want to recognize either the expense or the revenue associated with that transaction properly without having to do a bunch of manual accrual entries and reversal entries and accrual entries and reversal entries and keep track of all that. We can simplify all of that. In this case, I'm going to do it at the payables management, so payables transaction entry level, and I'm only going to focus on the account distribution type that's tagged with the purchase. And then I'm going to do some basic calculations for this, which revenue or which cost recognition account to use, which deferral account to use. And then when I process the transaction in AP, I code in the appropriate revenue or expense deferral account that's defined here. I'm going to get prompted to go through and specify how many periods do I want to defer over. So I've left that blank here in my setup. And I've also left blank the start date. So that'll default to the document date itself. So if I get an insurance policy from my insurance vendor, it's a 6-month policy for some reason, I can book that payable one time. I can defer the recognition of that expense over 6 future periods. And when I post that transaction, I post all of the general ledger journal entries simultaneously. It's the only time in the GP system where we will do an automated or system level post into a closed period. You can have those future periods closed for all other purposes, but we'll go ahead and let the revenue or expense deferrals dictate that we can post into those future closed periods. So again, I can handle that revenue or that expense deferral activity in a single step, only treat it one time and do it right the whole time through. So the next piece that I want to talk about is reconcile to general ledger. And this is a function inside the routines menu of the financial called reconcile to GL. And what this does is it allows me to look at a specific subledger, payables, receivables, inventory, or bank reconciliation. In this example, I'd take a look at payables management. I'll specify the date range that I want to look at, comparing the general ledger to subledger, and the reconciliation as of date, whatever the system date that it might be. So we can pick up anything in that period of time from posting within that date range. And then over in the top right in the accounts section, I'll specify which accounts or multiple accounts. In this case, I have a single AP account I'm going to compare against, but I could have multiple accounts there and compare all at once. Then underneath this, I have an output file. And from the output file, what I'm going to do is run this and create an Excel report. And then from that Excel report, I'm going to get a comparison of general ledger to subledger. So simply defining where am I going to place that output. When I run the report, this is what I get back. On the left-hand side, I get my subledger transactions in detail. On the right-hand side, I get general ledger transactions. And where possible, we have matched off everything. That bottom section of matched transactions, general ledger and subledger agree on the date, the dollar amounts, the distributions, other references. The section above that, we think probably matches. Everything looks pretty close, but maybe there's a small discrepancy between dates, or there's a small dollar discrepancy that needs to be explained, something of that type. And then the top section, the unmatched transactions, this is anything that's found solely in one ledger and not the other. So there's not even a potential match. I've got a journal entry here on the general ledger side. There is no corresponding AP transaction. I need to investigate that journal entry and figure out why someone's posting directly to AP instead of posting it through the subledger the way they're supposed to do it. So that's reconciliation between general ledger and subledger. And again, just a way to speed up your month end and your year end close process. Do a process in GP that basically replaces a lot of the manual ticking and tying maybe people are doing currently. The next piece that I want to talk about is on the purchase requisition and purchase order prepayment side. So I've switched to the purchasing menu. And from transactions, I'm going to start at purchase requisition. Purchase requisition, just a request to purchase, one step prior to actually issuing a purchase order. This can be opened up to other members of the organization through what we call a team member license. If they need to purchase something, this can be initiated by someone who doesn't normally work inside GP, but this might be one of a very select set of functions that would be available to them. In this case, maybe just something coming in from the warehouse, need to resupply a particular part, asking for that permission to purchase the item. You'll see up at the top in the toolbar a submit button. And that submit button is what's used to initiate the workflow, because this can tie into a workflow process as well. And I'll go into greater detail on the workflow in a little bit. But just as an illustration of that, when you click the submit button, you first have to put in your comment. What would you like to do with that? And then from that comment, I now go back and take a look at the same requisition, and a couple things have changed. One, there's a feedback bar now included that'll tell me where we are in the steps of that requisition. First, which requisition's been initiated, so I know which path it's going to follow, who I'm waiting for to approve it, and what the due date and time for that activity is. We can also include a view history button there, and that view history will show the person creating the workflow, in this case the requisition, all the tasks that still remain, what's been completed, who else is going to be participating in the process. They're not left having to guess what's going to occur next inside that process. Now in my demo system, I have things set up where I can approve my own requisitions. So when I click on the workflow button, I'm given the option of approve, reject, or delegate, punt to somebody else to make the decision. I'll go ahead and click approve. And now that basic requisition has been completed, that feedback's provided to the user. The view history would show all the steps completed as well. But instead, I'm going to convert the requisition into purchase order. I do that by clicking on the Actions button and then click Purchase. And the first thing GP does now is to make sure that I have everything in place to convert the requisition to a purchase order. That is, do I have a valid vendor? Am I going to be creating a new PO or associating it to an open and existing PO? What's the item? All the other documentations are correct. If everything lines up with those check marks and there's no red X's, then I can go ahead and click on the Generate. Generate will create that new purchase order for me. I can see that here in my list of purchase orders. Put the check box, a little check mark, and then I can actually go in and edit my document. So the PO has been created from the requisition. All of that workflow history is going to survive with that, have an audit trail that goes with it. But in this case, I've got a large purchase, almost $200,000, and the vendor's asking for a $100,000 prepayment. In this case, I have the prepayment set up to only be available as a computer check and not as a manual payment, but that's a configuration choice. You could allow for a one-off manual payment if that's how you wanted to specify the system. If you did allow manual payment, then things like checkbook ID, check number, payment number, etc., would be available at this point. But because I've set mine to be computer checked only, all that information is grayed out. If I go ahead and click OK, then I am going to create in the background a payable open to my vendor for the amount of the prepayment. And next time I do a computer check run, that vendor's prepayment will go out. This is the basic setups that go into purchase order and prepayment setup. It's simply a checkbox to allow, and then to allow to either create manual prepayments, yes or no. And again, I have mine set to no. And the last thing I need to talk about is going to be in the admin setups. This is where you can create under the company setup custom payment terms. So this had not changed going back to my history. I started with GP version 3.1 in the middle 90s. And for most of that time up until this most recent release, you had the same limited set of options for creating payment terms. That's now been updated to allow you to give both greater flexibility around the due date calculations when you want to have it. So not just things like how many days or end of month, but you want to do it simply next month and how many days. Whatever choice you make here for the calculate and the due by periods, you can then add, if you need, an arbitrary number of extra days for some reason. So I want to make this due next month plus 15 days. So it's always due on the 15th of the following month. And then I have those same options available for the discount periods. So just a couple small things, but it allows a great deal more flexibility in how you need to set things up. And it takes what might have been a rather awkward process today of manually setting due dates. Just create the payment terms now the way you need them set up. From there, I want to turn to a little bit about reports and analytics. And I want to talk first about the all-in-one document viewers. These were introduced a couple versions back in GP, and they've continued to grow. Excel refreshable reports. This is an illustration I was talking about earlier where we can give greater access to the information in the GP system to a much larger group of users around your organization. Because they're going to be using Excel as the tool, they don't have to have a GP license because they never touch the GP software. Smart List Designer is now standard and included, so creating custom smart lists is pretty straightforward. That's been converted to mostly a plain English exercise, no more having to know the database structure by name. And then finally, Jet Reports, a free add-in for Excel, and I'll show you a couple of illustrations of that. So let's start with the all-in-one document viewers. I want to go first to the purchasing navigation list. And from there, we'll go in and click in on the vendors. I've just pulled up Ace Travel. When you click on the all-in-one viewer link from the toolbar, what you now get is a side-by-side listing of all the different activities and transactions that are either open or historic for that vendor. And then within those, a quick summary, document number, date, the amount perhaps, and a drill back link that'll take you to the appropriate inquiry window. It's a shorter way of navigating instead of going into the inquiry menus and having to do a series of drill downs or a series of inquiry windows to find different pieces of information. We're simply going to gather them all together, put them in one location for you. That's going to be true for vendors. Again, that drill back, take a look briefly into the vendors inquiry zoom. We'll also do it for customers, and we can do that for items. So any of the major master records now has an all-in-one viewer that allows me to specify what item I'm looking at and then drill back to see the different documents. The Excel refreshable reports. This is not only a very handy tool for those of us that are inside the GP user community and we're in GP all day long, but we've taken all of the old report writer reports and created an Excel-based version of that report. So in the case of my sales folders, I have 214 different Excel-based reports. Now, these may not have been deployed in your system for some reason previously, but it's a very straightforward exercise if we need to do so, and it is a system-wide installation. So if you do it one time, you'll do it for all of the GP user community. You'll see two different types of reports here in my options column. There are just those that end in reports and those that end in data connection. And you really need both components in order to make the report function as intended. So in this case, I'll take a look at the customer balance Excel report. And when I click on that link, it will actually open in Excel the same details that I would see in something like a smart list or traditional GP report. So my customer number, my customer name, and the current customer balance. Each of my column headers are available as drop-down filter lists. So I could say I only want to see customer balances greater than X, or I only want to see this range of customers, whatever it might be. But the real value is on the data tab, because on the data tab, we've now embedded the data connection necessary to allow this Excel report to talk directly to the GP database. And that means that users can click the refresh all whenever they want. And again, on a licensing perspective, if all they're going to do is open Excel and refresh their report, they don't need a GP license. They also don't need GP training, a GP user ID, just access to the report and the ability to hit refresh all. And you can now take GP's information and extend it to a much, much larger audience of people across the organization. That's Excel refreshable reports. I want to turn next real quickly and talk about smart lists. Just a couple simple, useful things for people, like you can move the dividing bar between the folder structure and the results viewer. Just right mouse click anywhere inside the folder structure and increase or decrease the width of that. And then, of course, when you expand out on any one of the views, if I expand out on a sales customer balance view, for example, you can now have that folder structure go away completely, allow it to simply disappear. Just make things a little simpler. More of the real estate's now available to see the results of the smart list itself. All the rest of the functionality across the top of the smart list toolbar remains unchanged, with the exception of the new or the modify. If I click on that new button, what that'll take me into is where I can create my own custom smart lists. I can start with one of the predefined views and say I want to modify that, use that as my basis point, because maybe it's got some columns missing that I'd like to get added. Or maybe I want to join it to a different table. And that's what I can start to do here. In the top right, you can see a selected fields box. Those are the values that I'm currently going to be displaying in my new smart list. On the left-hand side in the database view, I can see all of the different database tables that are available for smart list as a data source. And if I expand out on the Microsoft Dynamics GP, I can see the table structure there, financial, sales, a variety of views inside that. All of that done in their plain English names, so I don't have to know any of the table structure. In the top from the toolbar, and if I've made my selection from which tables and which fields I want to work with, I can create go-tos. So the same capability to have a go-to and a standard smart list, I can simply add those in. Those can either be an existing, as you see here, or I can add in other smart lists, other features, other reports. If I click on the Execute Query button in the toolbar, then you can see down the bottom of the Smart List Designer what's called the Results Preview. This is a view back from the data of what's going to be returned based upon the fields that I currently have selected. Just to the right of that tab, there's also a T-SQL query, and that T-SQL query is the actual data connection string that I will need if I want to make an Excel refreshable version of this report. That tells the database who is allowed to get the data, what tables to access, what fields to pull, what restrictions to go with it, etc. And so a real quick and simple way to build not only new smart lists, but new Excel refreshable reports based upon those smart lists. And just like the other Excel refreshables, I can now distribute those out and give access wherever I might need them. When I click Done, then it takes me back into the smart list. I now have a new folder called Demo. I have my new customer balance view, and I'm ready to use this just like I would any other record set inside smart list. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Jet Reports add-in. The Jet Reports is included now as part of the starter pack in the GP system. And it is essentially a means of viewing my GP data inside Excel and giving me one more ribbon or toolbar across the top that are all the different Jet controls. I did a webinar on Jet Reports a little earlier this year. The recording for that is up on our website. And I won't go through all the details of Jet Reports now, but essentially what it does is gives the report designer community inside your company a front-end tool to get directly to the GP data and build a variety of different reports. These reports can have different functions with them, and it's a pretty simple, quick, easy tool to learn to use. A basic inventory report, a month-by-month income statement, different view of the income statement with first my primary categories all rolled up. Then I can expand that out and see detail account by account, use Excel's properties to build charts, to build graphs, etc. All of that inside the Excel front end. And finally, talk about a couple of areas in tools and in automation. First thing I want to talk about are workflows and approvals. We saw a brief example of that in the requisition approval becoming a purchase order previously. Talk a little more detail about that. Document attach and scan, the simple means of making sure that I have a better audit trail and to take those external references, embed them into the GP transaction. And finally, we'll talk about the PISTOL, the Professional Services Tools Library. Just a brief overview on the workflows, right? A formal automated process for requesting and receiving approval for key tasks and activities. We're going to preserve all that information in an audit trail that would be visible later to any of the GP users or to an outside auditor who looked at, who approved. Our workflows can be conditional. We can use if-then logic to determine under what steps or under what conditions a workflow needs to be run. With one restriction, we have multiple workflow approval types, but you can only have one workflow approval process type active at once. So I could have a basic AP and a sophisticated AP, but I have to choose which one I'm going to operate currently. Workflow approval processes can also have non-GP users included in the process, and they can receive notifications and alerts via email. They do need to be part of your Active Directory setup. So that's how I'm going to identify within the system who's going to receive the emails, is by looking them up inside Active Directory. For our different ERP systems in the GP world, there are 18 workflows available out of the box. This little chart will illustrate under what module groups in the left-hand column, so under finance or sales or purchasing, what different processes or transaction types are included. And then over on the right-hand side, the following columns will indicate which GP version that particular workflow was initially released. Obviously, if you're in GP 2018, you have all of the workflows in your system. If you're back on GP 2013 R2, you only have 5 workflows currently available inside your system. And just to put that together, this is by comparison what's available over in the NAV, Dynamics 365 Business Central world. So the next thing, talk about workflow setups. I need to navigate into the administration setup to do these. And then within the company setup, there'll be a drop down for workflows. And there are really 3 pieces here. The workflow maintenance is where you define the individual workflows, the steps, the conditions. We'll take a look at those setups in just a second. You also need to define your workflow calendar. That is what hours of the day you want to have the engine looking for conditions and people allowed to submit in terms of calculating when something is due. Is it due in regular business hours, Monday through Friday from 8 to 6, or is it a 24/7 kind of operation? And then the email message setup is a one-time setup you'll need to go through to tell the system, tell GP, this is how and with which email address I'm going to use as the system or the admin, and that's going to do all the outbound communication for you. Within the workflow setups, again, we have those across the different modules, finance, sales, purchasing, inventory, and so forth. And then within each one of those different module groups, you have a handful to as many as 5 or 6 different transaction or master record types that you can control by an approval process. In this case, I have 2 of them set up and ready to run. They're indicated by the plus signs next to the IDs. So payables transaction approval has been created and purchase requisition approval has been created. We saw an illustration of the purchase requisition earlier. There are really 3 different steps you have to go through to create the purchase requisition approval. You start by defining a basic workflow. So in this case, I have a step called, for my basic requisition, no conditions present. I'm going to run this requisition approval process on every requisition that gets created. But I could do a condition that said based upon the value, has to be over $500, based upon the vendor class that the vendor belongs to. So if you're buying from a services vendor, that requires a requisition. If you're buying materials, that doesn't. Something of that nature. And then within that basic requisition step, I need to define what will occur there, who gets notification for what email types, etc. And then, as I said, on that basic requisition step, I need to define when it's going to occur, who it gets assigned to, what are the time limits that they have to respond, etc. What messages need to be emailed out. And that can include feedback to the originator. So an approver has read the email and approved it. We'll send an email back to the requester so they get an update. The requisition's been converted to a purchase order. Send an email back to the requester so they get an update. The workflow engine can provide notifications going both forward and backwards along the approval chain at any point in the process that you want to indicate that response is appropriate. The one restriction, of course, being that the people doing the email back and forth, getting the notifications, do have to be part of your Active Directory, so it's going to be restricted to people within your email domain. Document imaging real quickly. This is now available across all of our ERP systems. On the GP system, it's going to be done with a local setup. The document attachments have a flow concept with them. What I mean by that is I can create at the master record level a series of attachments that relate to a specific vendor, and then indicate that all of those attachments need to be flowed along with that master record information when I'm creating transactions or in a workflow process for that vendor. Examples might be things like a terms and conditions document, a current price list, any other restrictions or advice, whatever information you want to share with someone working with that master record. I can attach that record and then have that flow forward. In the GP system, scanning directly has now been enabled from a local printer. So if I'm doing anything in the AP process, I have a local scanner connected to my desktop or my workstation. As I'm doing AP process, I can scan directly from the scanner into my AP transaction and have that now saved like any other attachment in the system. If you need to step up from that, there are, of course, document imaging services that can include things like optical character recognition, the ability to machine read and try to interpret a document and actually send back a data file. A couple that we recommend on the GP side are groups like PaperSave or Alltech. For the NAV or the BC, those optical character services recognition, it is available as a service directly inside the product, and the engine that's being used in the background to run that is provided through Lexmark. So just a quick example of that, payables transaction. Up at the top, I have the attach function. You can see it's already shown as a piece of paper with a paper clip on it. That's a visual indication to the user that this document has an attachment associated with it. And if I click on that link, I can see what is actually here is the terms document that has flowed forward from the vendor. That's the origin of this document. And I could now, down in the lower right-hand corner with the scan button there, simply scan in the current invoice that goes with this document. And now going forward as part of the record set and being saved for backup purposes, audit purposes, etc., will be both the terms and conditions document and that scanned image of the invoice itself. And then finally, we'll talk quickly about the professional tools services library, Pistol. The Pistol is something that is now available for free to everyone. It used to be a add-on purchase when I first.
It is quoted here.
When I first got my exposure to it, this was kind of an unspoken of set of tools that the Great Plains Professional Services team used internally when they needed to make major changes or fixes inside their database. So you'll see in the lower left-hand corner, I have a nav link to the Pistol, and I have a single setup for that, the Pistol main setup. It will take a while for this to set up the first time you run it. And you need to do this as the SA or system admin user, and then it can be used by other regular GP user IDs and licenses. Once it gets done, what it's going to show you is a set of tools that allow you to go in and do mass updates to your database. Now, all the standard warnings, caveats, etc. apply here. Make sure you have a current SQL database backup before you start using this tool. When you use this tool, all other users will need to be out of the system. And if you have any doubts or concerns or worries, please contact your project manager and they'll be happy to walk you through using this. But what this allows me to do are things like, I want to change the way I have my vendor master records ID'd. When I first built the system, I did it with a 2 alpha 3 numeric code. It's no longer making any sense, and I want to change that, and I want to move everything to a 5 alpha 2 numeric code. And this tool set will allow you to go in and do that. What I would need to do is I need to have basically an Excel spreadsheet available as my source for the change. Column A shows the old value, column B shows the new value, and then I can click on the appropriate tool that I want to run. I go through the validate process, in this case changing customer numbers from one number to another. And then once that validation has been done successfully, I can simply click on import. It will pull in my Excel sheet as the start and end values, and I click convert. And when I run this tool, it is going to do it everywhere in the system. It'll change the master record. It'll change all the open transactions. It'll change all the historic transactions. It's literally the ability to go back and say, didn't think my decision very well when I first set up my customer numbers. Did it X? Should have done it this way. Need to make that change. That tool is available to you. Again, if you got any doubts or concerns or worries, we're happy to guide you through that process. Some people, it becomes something they do without too much hesitation. For others, you want someone to walk through, and that's understandable. And that brings me to the end of this webinar. Again, just trying to help you get a little bit more out of the GP system that you currently own, identify some features and functions like revenue and expense deferral, or the requisition and prepayment on purchase order capabilities, reports and analytics, whether that's Excel refreshables, the Smart List Designer, or JET reports, or here at the end where we talked about some of the things like the professional service tools library, how to set up workflows, the document attach and scan functions, etc. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and maybe you'll get a chance to join us on the 29th when we go through how to get the most out of Dynamics 365 BC. Thank you very much.